The snow came on a Wednesday. Not the polite kind. The kind that dusts the fence posts and melts by noon. The kind that comes from the north without warning and without apology. The kind that finds every gap in every wall and presses through it like it has a grievance. By mid-morning, the road to town was gone. By afternoon, the well handle was buried to the crossbar. By nightfall, the Harlan place, the Duval place, and every other homestead along the Bitter Creek Road had their stoves burning everything they owned, and still, the cold came through. At the Voss cabin, 3 miles up the slope from town, the temperature inside dropped to 41 degrees by Tuesday evening before the storm, which everyone would later say was the worst of it. Before the worst of it. The Voss family burned their spare chair, then the second set of shutters, then the oldest boy's rope bed frame. They burned their extra wagon wheel, spoke by spoke. By Thursday morning, they had nothing left to burn except the floor planks, and the floor planks, once gone, were gone. No one came to check on Ruth Halsey. This was not cruelty exactly. It was the arithmetic of a bad winter. Every family had its own arithmetic to do, and Ruth Halsey was a widow. And widows on the frontier were either managing or they were not. And either way, there was nothing to be done about it until the storm broke. What nobody knew, because nobody had thought to ask, was that Ruth Halsey had been preparing for this particular storm since August. Not this storm specifically. She had not known in August that the blizzard would come in November, that it would last 4 days, that it would kill 2 cattle over on the Jenner place and freeze solid the creek at its deepest bend for the first time in 11 years. She had not known any of that. She had only known what her mother had told her, and what her mother's mother had told her mother, and what a woman learns when she pays attention to the land the way some people pay attention to the sky, and some people pay attention to nothing at all. Her neighbors knew the sunflowers by July. Hard not to. Ruth Halsey had planted them against every wall of the cabin that faced north and west, which was most of the cabin. Not in neat rows, not as a garden is planted, with space between and intention visible. She had planted them thick, shoulder to shoulder, so close together the stalks pressed against each other as they grew, so close a man could barely push his hand between them. They went up in August, the way sunflowers do, without asking permission, past the windowsills, past the roof line, some of them pushing 8-9 feet before they turned their heads east in the morning and tracked the sun across the sky all day without wavering. It was the kind of thing people noticed and filed away under the category of widow's folly. Agnes Trent noticed first. She was the closest neighbor, half a mile down the road, and she had a particular gift for noticing things that were none of her business and sharing them with anyone who stood still long enough. She mentioned the sunflowers at the dry goods store in early August, the way she might mention a broken axle or a child who'd been dressed wrong for the weather. Ruth Halsey has gone and planted those great tall things all up against her walls, like she's trying to grow a fence out of flowers. Makes no kind of sense. Cyrus Aldwell, who ran the dry goods and had opinions about everything from land prices to the Lord's intentions, said that widows sometimes went a little soft in the head after the first lonely winter, meaning no disrespect to the deceased. A few heads nodded. The subject moved on to the price of flour. Ruth Halsey was not soft in the head. She was 38 years old, and she had been farming the same 40 acres for 9 years, first with her husband Thomas, and then, for the last 4, alone. Thomas had gone in the spring of 1884 from a fever that lasted 11 days and ended on a Sunday, which Ruth had always thought was either mercy or irony, and had never decided which. He left her the cabin, the land, a pair of mules, a debt at Aldwell's, and a marriage's worth of knowledge about this particular piece of ground. What she had added in the 4 years since was her own. She had learned the way the cold moved across the property in winter, how it rolled down the north slope and gathered in the low corner behind the woodpile before it found the walls. She had learned which walls shed water and which held it. She had learned that the north and west walls of the cabin, which faced the open plain and the prevailing winter wind, were where the cold entered first and most and stayed longest, and that no amount of chinking and patching ever fully stopped what came across that open ground with 400 miles of nothing to slow it down. She had learned this from Thomas, and she had learned it herself, lying awake in January, with her breath visible in the dark, feeling the specific cold that came through the west wall at the third log from the floor, which had always been the worst one. Thomas had packed it with clay 4 times, and it had never fully held. She had thought about it every winter. She had thought about it in a way that was not worry exactly, but the particular sustained attention a practical woman gives to a problem that hasn't been fully solved. The idea came from her mother's letters. Her mother had written from Pennsylvania in the spring of 1883, the year before Thomas died, a long letter full of garden advice that Ruth had read quickly and set aside. She found it again 3 winters later, going through the box she kept under the bed, looking for the seed catalog she'd stored there in October. The letter was near the bottom. She read it again slowly, because she had time, and because the winter was long, and because reading her mother's handwriting felt like a hand on her shoulder in the dark. The relevant paragraph was near the end, almost an afterthought, the way her mother's most important observations usually were. Her mother had written about the kitchen garden at the farm where Ruth had grown up, how the north wall of the old stone dairy had always grown things better than anywhere else on the property, and how her father had finally understood why after 40 years of wondering. The wall holds the day's heat, her mother had written, releases it all night. But it's more than that. What grows against the wall keeps the wall from losing what it holds. 2 things, keeping each other. Your father always said the wall grew the garden. I think the garden grew the wall. Ruth had sat with that paragraph for a long time. She went outside in the cold and stood at the west wall of the cabin and put her palm flat against the wood and thought about what her mother had described. The logs held the day's thin winter heat and lost it by midnight. She knew that. She had always known that. What she had not fully considered was the other direction. Not just what the wall gave to whatever grew against it, but what a mass of growing things, pressed close against a wall, might give back. She spent 3 winters thinking about it before she acted, not because she was uncertain, but because she was careful, and because she had no margin for a mistake that cost her the season. She read everything she could find. She wrote to her mother with questions her mother answered from memory and experience. She talked to no one local, because the local opinion on such things was predictable and cost her nothing to forgo. By the spring of 1888, she was ready. She chose sunflowers because her mother had suggested them, and because she understood them. She had grown them for seed, and for the oil, and for the birds that came for them in fall. She knew their habit. She knew they grew fast and tall and close, and that their stalks, even dried and standing, held some structural integrity through the winter if left uncut. She knew their roots went deep, and their root mass, closely planted, created a kind of interlocking mat below the soil that held against wind in a way a single plant could not. She planted them in late May, against the north wall first, then the west wall. Not a row, a mass. She put them in at 6 inches apart, which was closer than anyone planted sunflowers, closer than made conventional sense, and she watered them by hand through June while they established. By the end of July, they had closed the gaps between them entirely and formed what looked, from the road, like a wall of green pressed against the cabin wall. By August, they were above the roofline, and Agnes Trent had made her comment at the dry goods store, and the subject had passed on to the price of flour. Ruth let them stand through the fall. She did not cut them when they went to seed, did not harvest the heads for the oil as she sometimes did. She left them standing, dried and golden brown in October, still pressed shoulder to shoulder against the walls, the dead stalks holding the structure the live ones had built. In November, she packed straw into every gap between the stalks and the cabin wall, working methodically from the ground up, filling the spaces so that what stood against her cabin by the time the first hard cold came was not a row of dead flowers, but something more like a packed wall of dry organic matter, stem and seed head and straw together, 3 feet deep in places, reaching to the eaves. She had done this for 2 seasons before the big blizzard, which meant she had refined it twice and knew what worked and what needed adjustment. The second year, she had added a low rail fence along the outer edge of the planting to keep the mass from spreading when the stalks fell under heavy snow. The second year, she had also extended the planting to the north wall's full length, which she had only done partially the first time. The third year was the blizzard. The blizzard came on a Wednesday in the second week of November, and it came from the northwest, which was the direction Ruth had prepared for. She heard it before she saw it, the specific change in the wind's voice that meant something other than ordinary cold was coming. She had heard it twice before in 9 years on this ground, and she recognized it the way you recognize a face you have not seen in a long time, but have not forgotten. She spent the afternoon of Tuesday before the storm arrived doing the things she always did. She brought in extra wood, enough for 4 days. She checked the stock and moved the mules into the barn and packed extra straw around their stalls. She brought in the 2 chickens that had taken to roosting in the low fork of the elm near the south fence, which she had been meaning to move for a week and had not gotten to. She filled every available vessel with water from the well before it could freeze, lining them along the cabin floor, where they would stay liquid from the stove's heat. She did not do anything additional about the sunflowers. She had done that work in May and in the months following. There was nothing left to do about it. The preparation for this moment had happened long before the moment arrived. The storm hit Wednesday morning and did not ease until Saturday afternoon. Inside the cabin, Ruth Halsey was warmer than she had been in any previous winter in that house. This was not a dramatic warmth. It was not the warmth of a well-chinked new building with good logs and proper mortar. It was the specific, incremental warmth of a cabin that was losing heat more slowly than it had before. The difference between 38 degrees at the worst of it and 41 degrees, which was what the Voss family had faced 3 miles down the road. The difference between manageable cold and the cold that burned the floor planks. Ruth knew the difference because she had lived on the wrong side of it in previous winters. She had slept in a coat on January nights when the west wall lost its heat by 10 o'clock, and the cold that came through the third log from the floor made the whole room feel like an open field. She knew what that cold cost, and what it took to bear it, and what it did to a person over the length of a winter. This winter, it did not come. Not all of it. Not the part that had always come through the west wall. The wall still lost heat because walls do. But what it lost more slowly, because on the other side of the logs, pressed against the outer surface in a mass 3 feet deep, the dried stalks and packed straw and seed heads of 200 sunflowers were doing something that no chinking and no patching had ever fully accomplished. They were holding the cold out. Not by being a wall themselves, which they were not, but by creating a dead airspace between the wind and the wall, a buffer of still dry material that the wind could not penetrate the way it penetrated open air. The same principle that made a down blanket warm, which was not warmth itself, but the trapping of warmth already present. The wind still blew. The cold was still real. But between the wind and the logs there was now a layer that the wind could not reach through, and what it could not reach, it could not take. Ruth kept her stove at its ordinary level through the 4 days of the storm. She did not burn extra. She did not burn the furniture. She slept in her bed, under the blankets she always slept under, in the cabin that had always been her cabin, and the cold that came through the walls was the ordinary cold of a cold night, not the extraordinary cold of a cabin losing its heat to a northwestern gale across 400 miles of open plain. She thought about her mother's letter on the second night of the storm, when the wind was at its loudest, and the stove was burning at its ordinary pace, and the temperature in the cabin was 49 degrees, which was cold, but survivable, and entirely within the range of what Ruth had planned for. She thought about the paragraph near the end, the one that had seemed like an afterthought. 2 things, keeping each other. Your father always said the wall grew the garden. I think the garden grew the wall. She thought her mother had been right, as her mother usually was, about things that looked like small observations and were actually everything. On Saturday, the wind stopped. The silence after 4 days of sound was its own kind of shock. Ruth stood at the door for a moment before she opened it, aware of the quiet, orienting herself to the fact of it. Then, she pushed it open against the drift that had built against the south side of the door, the only side unprotected, which she had already decided to address the following spring, and stepped out into the white. The sunflowers were still standing. Partly. The outer edge of the mass had taken the full weight of the drifting snow, and a section along the northwest corner had collapsed under it. The dried stalks bent but not broken. The mass compressed but still present, still pressed against the logs. The intersection, the stalks closest to the wall, had barely moved. They stood against the logs the way they had stood since October, dense and brown and matted with straw, doing the thing she had asked them to do. Ruth stood in the snow and looked at them for a while. She was not given to sentiment about practical things. The sunflowers had worked, or they had not worked, and they had worked, and that was a fact the same as any other fact. She did not need to feel a particular way about it. What she felt, standing in the snow on the Saturday morning after the blizzard, was the specific, quiet satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem correctly. Not pride exactly. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a person who has been paying attention to the right things. She went back inside and put the kettle on. The town came back to life by Sunday. The road was passable by mid-morning, the sun on the snow making everything too bright to look at directly. Ruth heard the Volkswagen before she saw it, the sound of wheels in packed snow carrying far in the cold, still air. It was Owen Voss and his oldest boy. She knew them by the wagon and by the angle Owen held his shoulders, which was the angle of a man who had been through something and was not entirely sure what to do about it. He pulled up at her gate and sat for a moment before getting down. Ruth met him at the fence. He asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when the answer is not the answer he expected, and he is deciding how to receive it. Then he looked at the sunflower mass along the north wall. Looked at it for a while, the way a man looks at something he has seen 100 times and is only now actually looking at. His boy was looking too. Ruth waited. Owen Voss was not a complicated man. He was a practical man, which was a different thing and often a better one. He said quietly, no particular inflection. Those flowers. Ruth said yes. He was quiet another moment. Then he said, we burned the chair frame. Ruth said she had heard it was a hard storm. He said it was. He stood there a moment more. Then he said, how far back did you plant them? Ruth told him. 3 feet from the wall at the widest. 6 inches between plants. He looked at the wall again. His boy had gotten down from the wagon seat and was standing beside his father now, both of them looking at the dried stalks still pressed against the logs. Owen said, my west wall. Ruth said yes. He stood there. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a practical man doing arithmetic. Then he said, I'd need to know what kind. Ruth said she had seed. From the heads she'd cut before they fell. She had been keeping them in a tin on the shelf since October, against exactly this kind of question, though she had not been certain the question would come. She did not say that part. She said only that she had seed, and he could have some. Owen Voss nodded once. He looked at his boy. His boy was still looking at the wall. They did not stay long. There was too much to do, and the road would be better in the afternoon. Owen Voss climbed back up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and then paused and looked at Ruth, standing at her fence in the snow, and said something she would remember for a long time. He said, your husband had good sense. Ruth looked at him. He was looking at the sunflowers. She thought about telling him. She almost did. She thought about saying that Thomas had had good sense about most things, but not about this particular thing, which had been her idea, and her mother's idea before that, and that the problem with assuming a thing belonged to the husband was that it left the wife invisible in the accounting, and she had been invisible in the accounting long enough. She thought about saying all of that. Then she said, "It was my mother's idea first, then mine." Owen Voss looked at her. Something moved across his face, some recalibration, quick and silent. He nodded. "That seemed right," he said. Then he drove away. Agnes Trent came on Monday. This was not a surprise. Agnes Trent always came when there was something to observe, and the observation always preceded the questions, and the questions always preceded the conclusions she had already reached before she arrived. Ruth understood this about Agnes, and had long since stopped expecting anything different. Agnes arrived with a jar of preserved peaches, which was her standard opening, and stood at the door with the jar held out, and her eyes already moving to the sunflower mass along the north wall. Ruth accepted the peaches and invited her in, and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, because Agnes had never in 9 years declined coffee. Agnes sat at the table and looked at the window, which looked out on the north wall, which looked out on the sunflowers. She was quiet for longer than usual, which meant she was rearranging something she had thought she understood. Finally, she said, "How warm did it stay?" Ruth told her the range. Agnes was quiet again. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. She said, "We were burning the chair by Thursday." Ruth nodded. Agnes looked at her cup, then at the wall, then back at the cup. She said, "I told Cyrus Aldwell in August you'd gone soft." Ruth said she had heard something to that effect. Agnes had the grace to look uncomfortable, which was not something she often permitted herself. She said, "That was not a kind thing to say." Ruth said she had not expected kindness particularly. She said she had only wanted to be left alone to do what she was doing. Agnes was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "Could you show me?" "The planting. How far apart? What you pack between?" Ruth showed her. They went outside in the cold, and Ruth walked Agnes along the north wall and explained the spacing and the straw packing and the rail fence she had added in the second year to hold the mass in place when snow fell. Agnes listened with the focused attention of a woman who was revising something important. She asked practical questions. How deep to plant the straw? Whether the type of straw mattered? Whether the dried stalks had to be left standing or could be packed in after cutting? Ruth answered each question directly. She did not say, "I told you so," which she had not said and would not say, because it was not useful, and because the moment for that had passed, and because Agnes Trent asking practical questions in the cold outside the north wall of a widow's cabin was worth more than any satisfaction the other thing would have given. By Tuesday, Agnes Trent had mentioned it at the dry goods store, which was where she mentioned everything, and which was more effective than any newspaper the county possessed. By Wednesday, Ruth had received 3 visitors asking about the sunflowers. By Thursday, she had 4 requests for seed from the heads she had cut in October. She had more seed than 4 families needed, which she had known when she cut the heads, which was why she had cut more than her own planting required. She distributed the seed from the tin on the shelf. She answered questions. She explained the spacing, and the straw packing, and the second-year rail fence. She told each person what her mother had written, because the source of knowledge mattered, and because she wanted her mother credited. 2 things, keeping each other. The wall kept the garden. The garden kept the wall. Some people wrote it down. One woman, the Bergstrom wife, copied it on a piece of brown paper from the dry goods counter and folded it into her coat pocket. Ruth watched her do it and thought about her mother at the train platform, pressing the worn seed pouch into her hands, saying things Ruth had only half listened to at the time. Everything alive is giving something. You just have to be patient enough to see it. Cyrus Aldwell came on Friday. He came alone and without a jar of preserved peaches, which meant he had not had time to prepare the way Agnes had prepared, or had decided the preparation was not necessary, or had come specifically to make a point about not needing to prepare. Cyrus Aldwell was a man who communicated a great deal through what he chose not to do. He stood at her gate in the cold and looked at the sunflower mass and did not speak for a long time. Ruth waited at the fence. She had become skilled at waiting for men to say the thing they had come to say. Aldwell said, finally, "I told people you'd gone soft." Ruth said she was aware of that. He said, "That was not an accurate assessment." Ruth said no, it was not. He looked at the wall again. He was a large man, and he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin down, which was the posture of a man who is doing something that costs him something and has decided to do it anyway. He said, "I'd like to put in an order for seed, for the store. Whatever quantity you can spare." Ruth looked at him. He said, "There are 15 families on this road that burned furniture last week. Some of them have debts at my store, and I would prefer they survive the winter long enough to work them off." Ruth appreciated the honesty of that. It was not a warm statement, but it was a true one, and she had more use for true statements than warm ones at this point in her life. She said she could supply 30 families from what she had. She named a price that was fair in one direction and not the other. Aldwell looked at her. He had expected to set the price, which was his ordinary position in any transaction. He considered for a moment. Then he nodded. They did the arithmetic on the spot, standing at the gate in the cold. Ruth wrote nothing down. She kept numbers in her head the way her father had taught her, because a woman who could not be caught out on her own accounting was a woman who could not easily be cheated. Aldwell counted out what he owed and handed it over the fence, and Ruth put it in her coat pocket. He turned to go. Then he stopped and looked back at the wall once more. He said, "Where did you learn this?" Ruth said, "My mother told me. I thought about it for 3 years before I did anything." He nodded slowly. He said, "That's longer than most people think about anything." Ruth said that was probably right. He left. Ruth stood at the gate a while after his wagon had gone, feeling the cold settling into the afternoon and the particular quiet of a winter day when the wind has decided to rest. The sunflowers stood along the wall behind her, compressed and brown and serving. Still, the purpose she had asked of them. In the spring, she would clear them and turn their stems into the soil, where they would break down over the summer and give back to the ground what the ground had given them. She had planned this from the beginning. Nothing wasted. Everything in the rotation. She went inside and put more wood on the stove, a normal amount, not extra. The cabin was warm. The spring planting, she had already decided, would go in earlier than the previous years. She had enough seed now to plant the south wall as well, which she had been thinking about. The south wall needing less insulation than the north, but offering other benefits she had been considering in the way she considered things, slowly and thoroughly, and without announcing it to anyone until the thinking was done. She sat at the table with the tin of sunflower seeds in front of her and a piece of paper and wrote down the count. What she had distributed, what she had kept. She always kept more than she needed, because need was not a fixed thing, and the distance between enough and not enough could close faster than people expected. Outside the window, the north field was white and still and waiting for March. The fence posts stood in their caps of snow. The elm, near the south fence, where the chickens had roosted before the storm, showed its bare branches against the pale sky. She thought about Thomas sometimes on evenings like this, not with the grief that had been heavy for the first 2 years, but with the quieter kind, the kind that was more like memory than pain. He had been a good man and a practical one, and he had loved this ground the way she loved it, and if he could have seen what she had done with the west wall, he would have been, she thought, not surprised exactly, but something adjacent to surprised. The thing people feel when something they half expected finally arrives. She thought he would have said, "I should have thought of that," and she would have said, "You almost did," which was true. He had packed that third log 4 times with clay. He had felt the problem the same as she had felt it. He had just solved it in the direction of patching, which was the direction most people solve things. She had solved it in the direction of growing, which was the direction her mother had pointed her toward without knowing it, In a letter written from Pennsylvania in the spring of 1883, about the kitchen garden and the old stone dairy wall and the two things keeping each other. She put the lid back on the tin and set it on the shelf beside the others. Outside, the November light was going early, the way it did in that month, the sun dropping behind the ridge to the southwest and taking the warmth with it, leaving the long blue cold of the prairie evening. Inside, the stove held its heat. The logs held their warmth. Against the outside of the north and west walls, the dried stalks stood in their quiet mass and did what they had always been doing, which was the same thing the garden had always been doing, which was holding back the cold 1 degree at a time, without ceremony, without announcement, without anyone watching to see that it worked. It worked. That was the whole thing. That was enough.